Hi, everybody. Welcome to Bootstrapped Solo. I am Pratik Shah, and today we're going to be talking about the good, the bad, and the ugly about running your own practice. This podcast is for those that want to know what it's really like to start, run, and grow a practice. Today's guest is my very good friend, Abbas Kazerounian. He runs a 50-person practice, about 24, 25 lawyers that focus on individual and consumer class actions. And Abbs' practice is licensed in 18 states and have actual offices in 9 states. Is that accurate?
Yeah, that's about right. Yeah.
Awesome. Awesome. Thanks, Abbs, for coming on. I really appreciate it.
No, thank you. Thanks for having me. Really appreciate it.
Thanks, man. I know running a 50-person practice ain't easy, but it started with just you, right?
Well, me and Mike. Yeah.
You and Mike. Yeah, your partner.
Exactly. So it started straight out of law school, believe it or not. So
Okay.
I always knew I didn't want to work for anybody. And so I said to Mike when I left law school, you know, what do you think? And he said, yeah, let's give it a go. The only problem was I only had $200 left the day I passed the bar.
Right. I mean, that's kind of a crazy thing, right? You turn to somebody and you find somebody just as crazy as you to say, hey, look, we just passed the bar. We don't need anybody else. We're just going to run our own show. Did you guys talk about what kind of law you would do, or how did that go?
Well, you know, the only thing I knew was, and I always told Mike, it was that we have to be specialists at something. And I didn't know what that was, right? Mm. And at the beginning, we were taking everything: domestic battery cases, DUIs, divorces, you name it, we did it. And, you know, it was very unconventional. Like, you know, we had no real office. We set up out of a coffee shop because literally we had $200 in our pockets. And I had my Boost mobile flip phone, which was the number I put at the top of the header, and my broken laptop and Mike's kind of laptop from law school, and our jet printer. And that was really our resources when we first started.
That's what I want to get into, because I think you know, I think everybody kind of, this is back in the day pre-pandemic when working from home had a stigma and all these things, right? Nowadays it's a little bit different. But I think what you just said is super important, and what I would want everybody to know that's thinking about starting their own practice is there is no fancy equipment that you need.
No, you really don't, especially with modern technology and like, you know, interestingly, like, I mean, if you're involved in personal injury, the amount of motion work that you get in comparison to where, you know, the kind of work I do in federal court is a fraction. It's not to say that you get zero motion practice, but in comparison, it's, you know, chalk and cheese. Yeah. Like, and so, you know, and one thing I discovered is if you are resourceful and creative, you probably can get a solution without spending a lot of money, you know, right up front. So, for example, I didn't have Westlaw and Lexis at the beginning, but the law library has it, you know, and CEB, for example, offers one free, back then in 2007.
Yeah, they still offer that.
Yeah, 1 free year on, you know, on all their treatises and like research things for all graduates. So like, you know, I was, you know, using the hell out of that. And, you know, and I was asking for templates from friends and stuff from law school. But my biggest disadvantage was, of course, I had no contacts. You know, like I didn't know anybody in the legal field. And we were starting from literally from scratch. And our only resources, as far as people we knew, were our law professors and our law school brethren and sisters from law school. That was it, and where they were going.
Perfect.
And so that was the genesis of Kazerouni Law Group.
No, and I love that. And I want to deep dive right into that, right? Because I think there's a lot of books out there that talk about starting your own practice. There's a lot of people on social media, here, use my system, pay me $600 and I'll teach you how to run a practice. I want to just hyper-focus. Let's talk about that first week, okay? You graduate, you study for the bar, you pass the bar, you turn to Mike and you say, we're starting our own practice. What do you do day one?
So day one, Mike is like, well, we need a business license. And so that was, you know, when we had like a $400 budget to start our law firm. And, you know, it was already $50 in, like, for the business license.
Oh, crap. There's 30% of our budget's gone.
Exactly. And then so we were like, well, we can't afford an office. And so we went and got a Regis, and we were paying the bare minimum. It was like $20 a month just to get your mail. And then if we needed the conference room, we had to pay extra. And we were like, well, that's a good problem to have. We'll deal with it later, right? Yeah. So we paid the $20 so that somebody collects our mail and we have a reasonable, like, you know, good-looking address. But we needed a workspace. And so where we were working was on Culver and Jeffrey in Irvine at a Seattle's best coffee shop. And so every morning I would get Mike out of bed and would go at 8 o'clock, sit in the coffee shop and order a cup of coffee and start nursing the coffee and start like, and in quotation marks, working. And of course, the question is, what are you working on when you have zero cases?
I was just going to ask you that. What are you working on? You don't have any clients. What are you working on?
Yeah. And this is a period where Facebook had barely started. There was no Instagram. There was no TikTok. And, you know, and so me being me, I used what was our equivalent of social media back in the days. I was the Craigslist king.
Okay.
And so I was advertising, you know, business lawyer, divorce lawyer, criminal lawyer. And then even Craigslist only allowed you to put 3 ads up every day.
Right.
And it had this capture system. So there's me creating like 14 fake email accounts and trying to get around their capture system and put up 30 ads a day. Like, and you know, that took a considerable portion of the day. Like, I mean, it like took a couple of hours just to put up all the ads.
Right.
And Mike thought I was bananas. Right. But our biggest clients in the first 3 years actually came from Craigslist. We got this crazy business case. It was a copyright case against Craigslist, interestingly. Our client
how funny.
was being sued by Craigslist.
And he found the attorney on Craigslist.
Yeah, and we I think we got like over $100,000 in billables on that.
Wow.
And then there was another one. This guy just had like every problem in the world. Like you name it, the guy had it.
Yeah. I've had a few of those.
Yeah, he would show up and, you know, I think he was just lonely, really. Like, So we had it. And then we all had all these like DUI. You know, I'm being accused of beating up my wife. I had like, you know, like the whole plethora of the legal field. And
go ahead. Oh, so I was just going to say, so you're getting these calls and you spend the whole day putting all these ads up. The calls start coming in. First of all, you're filtering, right? Because I got to imagine a lot of the calls that come in are just a lot of crazies and no real case and nothing doing. I mean, how do you deal with that?
Well, there's a couple of things. I mean, it doesn't matter how successful you are and how big you are and established you are. You have to kiss some frogs along the way, right? I think that's. I mean,
that is the nice way of putting it.
I mean, but you know, I mean, you're in sales, right? Like you're one of the best salespeople I know. Like it's a numbers game. If you have to go through the duds in order to get to the good stuff.
100%.
Like, and so. Like, you know, I had a history in sales, like, you know, from back in England, and I knew that already.
Yeah.
And so, like, I understood the world of business, and it doesn't matter what profession you're in, whether you're in a medical business, in a trash can business, or in the law business, you're in sales. So I totally understood that.
Yeah.
But, like, the only filtering that we had was after about a couple of weeks, like, you know, Molly, the barista that worked there, like, was our friend. And so the phone would go, I would chuck it to Molly, and she would be like, Kazerouni Law Group, how can I help you? And I'm like, well there, Mr. Smith, let me see if Mr. Kazerounian is available. Like, Mr. Smith, and I'm like, yeah, fucking give it over. And give it back. Oh, hi, how you doing? And then suddenly the blender would go in the background, and then like, what is that noise? I'm like, oh, I'm sorry, I'm in the shredder room, and I'm like running out.
Construction in my office. There's
so. Like, you know, there'll be like different like creative ways of going through that. But, you know, there was some crazy things that we ended up like, there was this guy we ended up repping that was working out of Long Beach, and he was an absolute fraudster. He worked in an abandoned warehouse.
Yeah. And
the only thing in this, like maybe 30,000 square foot warehouse was a fax machine, no furniture, apart from his personal office. And there were cameras everywhere. And Mike and I going in, and Mike is swearing at me, walking like, I'm going to kill you. Like, I can't believe we're here. And so and this guy thought he was Scarface. And we go into his room, and it's got this plastic fireplace with one of those things like coming in with one bottle of Smirnoff behind him. And he thinks he's like feeling Al Pacino. And what he was doing is he was selling truckers insurance to truckers, but without the insurance. And then people would get in an accident. Yeah, and then he'd be calling us like, "Oh, this guy's after me." I'm like, "Yeah, I'm not surprised." And this guy would always pay our retainers in big bundles of cash. But he actually ended up being a real client that paid us, right? But then there was another woman that called us, and Mike and I drove all the way to LA to Koreatown, and it was a church, and the lady was a nun, and she was like, "I want to hire you to basically publish 1 million copies of the Bible, and I want to go on a mission, and I want you guys to create a 5013C, and I want you to like help me do this so I can spread the word of God, and I'm like, okay, and then so like we listened to her whole thing about what she wants. Then after an hour, I'm like, okay, well, we need $5,000 deposit so that we can get started. Right. And then she's like, well, what I was hoping was that you do this free and God will pay you back in 1,000 fold in the future. And literally, I just stand up and I just walk straight out. I don't even want to, I walk straight out. Mike is left there. And he's like, it's like, it was kind of crazy.
This brings up a good point. How many leads like that did you chase? Like in the early days, you chase anything that comes in because you don't know what's going to be good. You don't have that filter yet, that instinct. How often would you run into something where you thought it was going to be something and it turned out to be a big bust?
A lot.
All the time, right? All the time.
I mean, I have no numbers for it, but
right.
For every 3 of those, you get 1 case.
Correct.
And so, but the upside was we were both broke, and so we had nothing to lose.
Right. And your time's not worth anything at that point, right? None of ours is because you're not doing anything. It's not like you have opportunity cost that instead of that time being spent chasing down a nothing burger, it could have been spent on a case because you don't have any cases.
Not only that, though, but I think it's essential to earn those stripes and that substance that is intangible in the education of law business, right? Like you have to go through that to understand what it's like on the front line in getting cases. Because if it's given to you easy, you can't relate to your intake individual.
Right.
And when you're a bigger entity, when they're like, oh, I've got this nut job on the phone that's telling me this and that. And like, because if you've never experienced it, it's very easy to go, well, you need to be professional and like blah, blah, blah. And of course, you do need to be professional.
Right.
But unless you've gone through that and had that education and had that person-to-person interaction, whether they're a great case or whether they're a total dud and a crazy, is really, really important to the education of a fully rounded lawyer.
Yeah.
Because, we hear a lot about you need to be a trial lawyer. You need to, be good at writing. And that's all true. Like, you need all these elements and all these skills. But there are these intangible factors that make you a people person, that make you want you to represent them. And that, I'm sorry.
No, you're right. And that's what we call like teacher. There's a certain lesson that experience teaches you that you can't get taught in school. You can't get taught by a classroom or a CLE, no matter how many conferences you go to. There's just something about returning those calls, picking up the phone, answering the client, chasing potential clients down, trying to collect from them. Because what happened to me in the early days, and I guarantee it happened to you, is people are like, I'm going to pay you. They give you a little bit of a deposit up front, and then good luck ever collecting the rest.
Yeah,
all
absolutely.
The time.
Absolutely. I mean, no question. But like it was part of the journey that I wouldn't swap. I really wouldn't swap it. Like, it wasn't pleasant. It was demoralizing sometimes.
And it's easy to look back on it now and think of it fondly, right? Because we got through it and now you're on the other side of it and you're not dealing with that anymore. But in the beginning, were there times where you question, why am I doing this? Why don't I just get a job somewhere?
Yeah, of course. I absolutely questioned it, and I think that innate belief to be able to always like be positive about something, even if it's the smallest thing, and claw onto that to get you to the next positive thing, right? And hopefully those positives get bigger and bigger and bigger. And before the show, you were asking me, how we got into where we got, and that's a story in itself. And it started from a very, very small positive into what became a class action practice.
Yeah, tell us.
And so, like, we got a reputation in the coffee shop in like the local Irvine area that these two clowns had a law firm, and if you want to just go sit and shoot the shit with them and talk the law with them, they'll give you free advice and all that kind of stuff. Excuse me. And so one day this guy comes in and he goes, "Hey, I've been sued by Capital One for my credit card for $3,000. And all the lawyers I go to, they want $250, $350, $400 an hour. And if I could afford that, I'd pay off the credit card."
Yeah.
And I was like, listen, all the way to trial, doesn't matter what it takes, just give me 500 flat fee, we're done. And he was like, really? And I'm like, yeah.
Well, that
so
500 was more than you started your firm with. So.
Oh my God, 500. I was like, I'll take that. You know, like, you know how many coffees that would buy me? That's our rent for like the next 3 months. Like, so I was over the moon because it was one of those days where I needed to pay car insurance or to top up my Boost Mobile $40 a month or something. You know, it was a desperate day. And the 500, and I said, I need it today. He goes to the cash machine, gets 500, he comes back, and we're off to the races. And so it was it wasn't going to change my life, but it got me through the day, and I was in a good mood, right? So I file an answer, I send some discovery, and then a week and a half later, the guy calls me, and he says, hey, you represent me, right? And I'm like, of course, I'm your lawyer. And he said, well, they keep calling me. I'm like, who is? And he's like, Capital One is. And I'm like, really? And so I'm like, I was like, I know it's an ethical violation, but I was like, so I was like, there's something here. So I go to the law library and I start researching, right, on Westlaw. And I find this thing called the Rosenthal Act. And I come back and I'm like, Mike, I think we can sue Cap One. And he's like, really? And I'm like, yeah. And so he's like, okay. So we sue Cap One. Next thing I know, in literally 30 days, the guy's debt gets waived. He gets $1,000 in his pocket, and then we got another $5,500 in our pockets.
Oh my God!
I was like, this is magic. What is this wizardry?
Gold mine. Yeah.
And we're in the depths of the 2007 recession right now.
Right.
And and then I go back to the law library and I pull all the main cases from the Ninth Circuit and whatever, and I realize it's the sister statute of a federal statute called the Fdcpa.
Right.
And I was telling Mike, I was like, you know how we're always fighting for clients? This thing sells itself. We don't charge our clients any money because we get attorney's fees on these statutes. And essentially, like, I'm reading the statute and I'm like, there's a billion ways to violate the statute. And I look nationwide, and there were literally only 200 law firms that did this full time.
Wow.
In the entire United States.
That's nothing.
Nothing. And so, there's probably more than 200 PI attorneys in Orange County alone.
Orange County, right, exactly, yeah.
And so I was like, okay. And so we started going to our friends and family first. They all had credit card debt, and they're all like being harassed by debt collectors and whatever. And next thing I know, every case I'm in federal court. I start filing in state court, but then they start removing me.
Yeah.
But the upside of that is that almost all your opinions are published.
Right.
And so within like 2-3 years, I've got like 20 published opinions, and I'm doing, we're making suddenly like, we actually could actually afford an office. We have an office,
right. Real money.
Yeah. We actually can have a clerk that we pay or something, and like we've got real cases, and we're in federal court doing real proper law.
Right.
And I'm getting calls all of a sudden from Nebraska, Texas. They're like, we saw this case you did. Do you want to come and litigate this with us? And that kind of started lending itself to becoming a kind of a subject matter expertise in like suing debt collectors.
Right.
And at the beginning, even the judges in California really weren't educated on this. And I would go into court, especially state court, if I was in state court, they'd be like, hold on a minute. Your client owes money and you're suing them. And I'm like, yeah. Educate the judiciary. And then once I became kind of deemed the guy.
Yeah.
In motion practice, suddenly I noticed the judges are giving deference to me because they know I know what I'm talking about because they've been down that road with me before.
Right.
And the ACA National Conference ended up being in 2008 or 9, I think 8, in San Diego. And the ACA is the organization that is basically where all the debt collectors belong to. And at that time, I was not a known entity by the debt collecting industry. Like right now, if I walked into ACA, I'd probably get lynched. They all know. Yeah, they know who I am.
Yeah.
And so I walked in and nobody said anything. And then there was a closed door meeting. And so we walk into the closed door. Well, I walked into the closed door meeting and nobody questioned me. And I'm just sitting there. And they're like, well, you know what, guys? We're really worried about this thing called the Telephone Consumer Protection Act, the TCPA. It's a major liability, and you're going to have to settle real quick. if these lawsuits are like filed.
You're just like listening to this, like, I can't believe they're just telling me this.
Yeah, and I'm like,
yeah, exactly.
Yeah. And after that closed door session, I didn't even stay. I just ran back to the office.
Right.
And and the first thing I did was, because I knew I wouldn't, I knew that these were going to be class actions because that's what they were talking about, and I wouldn't qualify as class counsel because one of the elements of Rule 23 is adequacy, and you need to have done prior class actions. So we went and found this guy that was on the edge of retirement that had done a lot of class actions who just didn't care.
Yeah.
And and I was this crazy guy in his office going, listen, I've got this thing. It's called the TCPA. You don't have to do anything apart from put your name on the pleading. And he was like, I'm not really sure. And then all my friends that knew about this, they're like, oh, and I quote, one of my friends said, Abbas is chasing rainbows. Those were his exact words. And Mike, to his credit, was kind of feeding us because he was going to PI shops and litigating the crap they didn't want.
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
So, and I was dealing with the debt collection stuff, and I was trying to get into the class action world.
Right.
Chasing rainbows, as they said. And I kind of I said, Mike, if we're going to do this, we have to double down, because if I file this and people see that it's successful, they're going to all file. Right? So within a space of 6 months, I filed maybe 40 class actions against Sally Mae, Bank of America. But then Bank of America has different lines. There's the mortgage line, there's the auto line, there's the credit card line, and the same with Wells Fargo. There's the same with Chase, and the same with HSBC, Santander, et cetera, et cetera.
Right.
So within 18 months of that first lawsuit, Sally Mae fell first with $25 million.
Wow.
And then it was Bank of America 1, $30 million. Bank of America 2, $17 million. Wells Fargo 1, $17 million. And so on and so forth.
Wow.
So, I mean, I literally made that guy a zillionaire.
Right. Well, there's a couple of things I want to just jump in real quick, because there was a couple of things I think there were some important lessons in what you just talked about. One is that your efforts compound, right? Like you said, you took that one case, turned into 2 cases, 3 cases. As you keep grinding out and becoming competent in the law and studying, it doesn't happen overnight. It doesn't happen over 6 months. It compounds and it grows, and you have to commit that time and understand that it's going to take a long time.
For sure. Absolutely. I mean, I'm talking kind of in cliff notes here, right?
Right, of course.
I mean, there were hours and hours of motion practice, and there was nobody there to do the motion practice for us. And so, I would be doing it, and I'm going against, Ivy League guys at national top 50 law firms. I'm going against Shepard Mullin. I'm going against Gibson Dunn.
And they're taking no mercy.
They don't care. They just want to impress their client. And, and the thing I always fell back to is hey, if you do a good job writing, you're dealing with the same rules of civil procedure, you're dealing with the same case law.
Exactly.
And I know the statute is on my side. I'm going to win this.
Exactly.
And so, that kind of, at first it was intimidating when you get Latham Watkins on the other side and all these different major national law firms. But after the 10th time, you kind of,
it's all the same stuff.
It's all the same.
You said it exactly right. The statutes are the same. They don't play by a different set of rules. They don't play by the court rules. The local rules of court are all over the internet, easy to see. It just takes time. The one advantage you have is time.
And then by that time, you realize that they're in your wheelhouse.
Mm-hmm.
You set the terms, because I choose my client, they don't. I choose my case, they don't. I choose the forum, they don't. And so I choose the causes of action, they don't.
And so, the other thing is, they don't even know you're going to sue them until you sue them. So you've got the opportunity to investigate your case, make sure it's a righteous case, make sure the law is on your side before you go down to the courthouse and file that lawsuit.
Exactly right. And so, I'm sorry.
No, the other thing I was going to say is, it sounds like, based on what you're saying, the number one thing you focused on is making sure there was competent representation for your client. So that included not only doing your research, but going to somebody who's done it and say, hey, look, this is what's going on, right? Maybe he didn't do TCPA, but he had done federal class actions, and they can guide you through the process of how the judges are going to react to things. Every federal judge runs their courtroom a different way. I mean, more 100%. So than state court, federal judges have full control of their courtroom, right?
Yeah, I mean, one of the biggest learning curves was the difference between state and federal court. you can get away with so much in state court. And it's like state court is so elastic in its like flexibility, and if you make a mess of something in federal court, you can really ruin a good case procedurally if you screw that up.
Yeah.
It's very unforgiving. It can be very unforgiving. And the judges have a lot of discretion with that.
They could just dismiss your case. There's nothing you can do.
Sure. Yeah. It's like, I mean, they're not running for re-election. They don't care. Like,
they're there for life. You can't do anything to them.
Exactly right. And so like, it's a very, very intimidating place. And it's an art form just to get comfortable in federal court. Right. And it's hard to get comfortable in federal court. Like,
and the deadlines in federal court are real deadlines. There's no, hey, me and defense attorney or me and plaintiff's attorney agreed that we're going to extend the deadline. No. The judge sets the deadline. And if you want to extend it, you need permission from the judge. And a lot of times the judge will give it to you, but you still got to file the proper paperwork and let the judge know in time that you want this extension. So, I mean, did you just rely on your co-counsel for a lot of that stuff, or what did you do with all that? No, because
I'd been doing a lot of federal litigation with the Fdcpa individual stuff first.
Before that,
I was already getting very comfortable with federal court, and I began to know the judges.
Got it.
So, like the one thing I had to do is really get to grasp with Rule 23 and really the class action practice, because that's in its own animal. It's really its own animal.
Got it. Now, I want to kind of rewind a little bit, go back to before you got into the FDCPA stuff, when you were kind of taking anything, right? The Craigslist call, the DUIs, the domestic violence. How did you make sure to provide competent representation for your clients with being a brand new lawyer, you know, not working for a firm, not having information, and getting all kinds of different clients with different kinds of issues?
That's a really good question. And the answer is, my philosophy was always take the case, ask questions later, because if it was outside our competency level and we felt uncomfortable, we can always associate somebody in, right?
That's right.
I'd rather have 50% of something and bird in the hand rather than two in the bush, right?
That's right.
So it's never, you should never get greedy and say, well, I'm going to do this myself when you just can't do it, right? Because it just doesn't work that way, because, you know, because you're going to lose your license quicker than it took you to gain it. And so I was totally like, you know, aware and cognizant of that. But like, for example, my first DUI, I had 3 friends that worked at the public defender's office. I would call them up, like that left law school, and I'd be like, hey, like, tell me what, and they're like, let me walk you through. This is Kate. You don't need anybody to help you. Like, this is how you do it, right? And, you know, it's a learning curve. But like, the one time I was out of my depth is because I didn't know I was out of my depth until it was too late. And that was also a criminal case. And it ended up, I mean, it's a crazy story. It's so like this private investigator had come to me to buy him 30 days because he'd bounced 120 grand's worth of checks with a bank, and he'd been accused of fraud. And he said, if you buy me the 30 days, I'll pay the money back and make it go away. So I called the bank, negotiated it. The guy gave me 3 grand for my time. I made it go away. He paid it, and I didn't think about it again. But then, maybe 6 weeks later, middle of the night, like 10 p.m. at night, I get a phone call on the Boost Mobile bat phone.
Right.
And I would pick that phone up any time of the day, like, because, you know, you do. And it was this, like, you know, foreign lady who said that she was the girlfriend of that particular old client.
Yeah.
And he'd been arrested, and his arraignment was at 2 p.m. the next afternoon. And you got to ask Mike about this story, but I'll tell it to you anyway. And I was like, well, I need money. And she's like, oh, he'll give it to you when you get there. And I'm like, okay, what's it about? She goes, I don't know. She goes, like, he just said, it's just an arraignment. It's just an arraignment.
Yeah.
And I was like, and in my head, I'm like, I've done arraignments before. Like, how hard could this be?
Yeah.
Even though I've never done federal arraignment, but like, whatever.
You're right.
So Mike and I'm like, Mike, you're coming with me on this. I don't know what the hell's going on. So he's like, okay. So Mike's driving me, and we go to LA. And 2 o'clock, and I'm looking on the board, looking for this guy's name, and I can't find it. And so I go to the clerk's office. I'm like, hey, I'm looking for this gentleman, and I was asked to come to represent him for an arraignment. And she's like, I can't find it. Then as I was saying this, there was a DEA agent that was like finalizing a complaint. He handed it to the clerk. He goes, oh, I believe this is your client. and he handed me the count, and it had 16 counts against my client.
Oh my God.
The guy had been caught transporting 40 kilos of cocaine across state lines in Florida.
What happened to the bad checks? Not bad checks?
Yes. So, well, I guess he needed money to buy coke.
He graduated quickly from bad checks.
He was selling to a DEA agent in a sting operation,
allegedly.
And so allegedly he got bust in a sting operation selling 40 kilos of coke across state lines in a rented car.
Yeah.
And I look at Mike, and like my world is like crumbling in front of me. I'm like, oh, what have I got myself into?
Right.
And I don't know how this thing works. So I'm like, okay. So the clerk's like, yeah, you got to go to this courtroom. And the magistrate was doing the arraignments. And so you know, arraignments in federal court, they go to the middle of the night, as long as it takes till everyone is being arraigned. That's scheduled for that day. And it's already like, by the time I get into court, it's like 2:30, 2:40. And it's such an intimidating atmosphere. You go in and everyone knows each other and they're all high-fiving each other.
Yeah,
hey, bro, how you doing? You know, all this kind of stuff.
Yeah.
And I'm thinking, what the hell? And so, and unbeknownst to me, my client had 3 co-defendants that all had public defenders, right? Like federal defenders. He's the only one that's gone private. That will become pertinent later. So then I'm like, Mike, what do we do? He goes, I don't know. And so then we see the client come into the cage. And then the client looks like crap. I mean, like, yeah, clearly hasn't showered, and he's like crying and all this kind of stuff. And then like, I don't know what to do. So I'm like, like I wave at him.
Right.
And then the bailiff is kind of looking at me funny. And then I'm like, can I speak to my client? And he goes, of course you can. He goes, yeah, you go into the cage. I'm like, yeah, I go into the cage.
I do that. Of course I do
that. Kind of thing.
Duh. Yeah.
And I go into the cage, and the client is like kind of, I mean, you're in front of all the other criminals, right? Alleged criminal. And so I'm like, hey, like, what happened? He goes, yeah, this is like totally messed up, man. You got to get me out of here. I'm like, what do you mean get you out of here? I was like, you're facing like 40 years in prison. Like, what are you talking about? He's like, you need to get me out of here tonight. Like, I'm dying. This is all a big mistake. And I'm like, listen, I need, like, I'll do my best, but no promises. And I'm like, but by the way, we need a retainer. And then he's like, like, I'll take care of this after. And I'm already angry because like I haven't been paid. Right. I mean, like, whatever. So we go out, and there is one of the DEA agent comes and has his like, this is your client's belongings. And so I'm like, Mike, like, we need to do 2 things. We need to write a retainer agreement. And so Mike's in charge of like writing the retainer agreement on the back of a pad, right? Yeah. With the pertinent terms. And we need to itemize his stuff that we're going to give to his girlfriend after the fact. And as we're going through the itemization, there's a huge roll of cash. Oh. And then I'm like waving to the client. I'm like,
this is my retainer? Yeah.
And then he's like, and then I'm like, okay, let me come talk to you. Yeah. So I'm like, hey man, you got to pay me. He goes, okay, fine. Like, so I go back in the cage. I'm like, that's got to be up. Like, I mean, we're coming here at no notice. So he goes, fair enough. So we're counting the money. So we're having him sign it in the cage. And then I'm like, okay, now what do I do? So then I go see the AUSA, right? Yeah. And the Mike thinks that's a good idea. So I do.
Don't blame Mike. Don't blame Mike.
Yeah, no. Mike's like in the gallery, kind of like chuckling. And so this huge guy who's the public defender comes up and he's like, yeah, I represent the co-defendant. And we go into this private room. And then the AUSA is like, what would you like? I'm like, I'd like OR. And OR means on recognizance, right?
Yeah, right, on recognizance.
And then this guy, the federal defender, like cracking up. And I'm like, well, what is wrong with you? He goes, there is no OR in federal court.
Yeah.
And I'm like, well, I want it. And then I'm like, and then the guy's like facing 40 years. What are you talking about? I said, listen, he's a private investigator, clean record, and he's not a security risk. He'll give in his passport. We'll do a conditional bond. If he doesn't show up in Florida for his next hearing, you can basically put out a warrant for $1 million. And the guy's like, I don't know. I've got to talk to my supervisor. This kid I was so lucky, was straight out of Yale.
Oh.
And it was his first year.
And because if you had somebody with any experience, they would have just told you to get out of here.
Yeah, go pound sand. Exactly.
Yeah, exactly.
So now it's like a waiting game, right? And so I am like a little puppy dog, and I'm following this AUSA around the courtroom, and the guy keeps turning around. I'm like, what about now? And then he's like, dude, just leave me alone. And I'm just relentless. I just will not give up, right?
Right.
And so this goes on, and it's like 7 p.m. at night. And then I'm like, listen, we've been waiting for 4 hours. Like, yay or not? And the guy supervisor's clearly gone home.
Yeah.
So he decides to make a call. He goes, yeah, I pulled his I pulled his history, and he's got a rap sheet. Fine, I'll agree to it.
Oh my goodness!
And then the federal defender hears about it. He runs into court, and he's like, "What the fuck?" Like, and he's like, "I want the same deal."
Yeah.
And then he's like, "Fine, okay." So he's looking at me. He's like, "You're the man. You are the man." And then so this goes on for a little bit. And then I'm sitting there and I'm watching the other arraignments. And then I see this other guy who's been like being prosecuted for I don't know what. And then the federal defender's like, Your Honor, I'd like to bring a 384 motion so that the state pays for my client to go to Pennsylvania.
You're like, I want that.
And I'm like, I'll write that down. Yeah,
384. I got it now.
Yeah, so I'm making up the number, whatever it was.
Whatever,
and so,
right,
so the judge is like, granted. And I'm all excited. I'm like, this is great.
Yeah.
And so we're called, and it's like 7:30 at night already. And the judge, his name was Judge Kenton, who is now a mediator. And I met him like 10 years later as a mediator. And I'm like, Judge, you remind me of this judge. But at the time, he didn't know me for toffee, of course.
Yeah.
And then I was like, so the state has said, well, the U.S. has said, and they'll agree to this conditional bond. He goes, what? He goes, sidebar right now. And the entire day, no sidebars had gone down.
Oh,
and I'm like, this is not happening. So I'm going there. And then the judge starts chewing out the AUSA. He's like, you better know what you're doing. Like, this is outrageous.
Oh, my goodness.
And so we go back, and then and then you go, anything else? And then my client puts his hand up. He's like, can I register? Can I surrender my passport at 9 o'clock, not 8 o'clock?
Oh, my God, bro.
I don't want to see that.
Yeah, what are you
doing? I'm like, and he goes, anything else? And I'm like, yes, one more thing, Your Honor. He goes, what? He goes, I'd like to bring a 384 motion to have the state pay for the extradition to Florida.
Right.
He's like, let me get this straight. Your client is the only one with a private lawyer. Your client is the only one with a stack of cash in his private property with a private lawyer with this crazy, outrageous deal that I don't want to prove to. And then you want the state to pay for him to go to Florida. I'm like, it was worth an ask, Your Honor. You know,
exactly. Yeah.
And then when I said that, actually, that made him crack up.
Yeah.
So, long story short, well, not short because it was a long story. Long story is I walked him that night.
No way.
Yeah.
So you're just like, well, I guess I'm a federal criminal defender now.
Well, the head of the federal defender, who was he was the deputy head, not the head. He offered me a job on the way out.
Wow.
You asked Mike. He offered me a job at the federal defenders when we left, and Mike was like, "Take it." I was like, "No."
Did you show him the wad of cash and be like, "Can you pay me in wads of cash? Because that might do it."
No, I just needed to get out of there. I just needed to get out of there.
Oh my God, yeah. That's one of those days when you're starting out, you just go home and you need to have a drink because you're like, "What did I get myself into?"
Honestly, I don't even know how that happened. Like, that would never happen now. Like, it was just totally beginner's luck. And all the stars were aligned. Like, if that happened right now, me being a 15-year lawyer, that would not happen.
Right. Another thing you brought up that I think is an important point is you called a lot of people for help. Like, throughout these stories that you've told us, not only did you go to the law library, do your own research, you called your friends that were public defenders, you found this federal court class action guy. Like, it sounds like through this process, you're constantly trying to find people that can help you. And I did the same thing going through it. I would just Google lawyers and find somebody to talk to me and tell me how to do this area of law because I didn't know what I was doing. But, I mean, did you do that for everything when it came to, the domestic violence and all the other things you were doing?
Of course. That's why, luckily, both Mike and I had a very good network from law school. And so we knew all our friends because that's the only network we had.
Right.
We knew what kind of firms they were working at, where they were working, and we utilized our network to its absolute maximum, considering where we were in our career and at that particular time. Obviously, my network now is very different to what it was 15 years ago.
Right. Well, how do you get? I mean, here's a question: how do you get these people to help you? Like, what do you do for them? What do you offer them? How do you get them to help you?
I mean, like, I'm just asking them for 10 minutes of their time, you know, or whatever. Like, these are friends, and so, like, you know, as long as you're willing to reciprocate, like, you know, if my buddy calls and goes, "Hey, my mom is being sued by a debt collector," I'm not going to charge him for that, right? Like, because it's my buddy, and so I'm gonna represent them because, you know, if you act kindly towards your brethren and your sisters, like, you know, you would hope that it's not, you wouldn't do it with the expectation that they're going to reciprocate. But I can tell you that kindness is usually comes around in multiple fold.
Right.
And I think, like, you know, one of the early lessons I've learned in life is that if you're good to people, they tend to be good back to you, you know? And so, you know, we were lucky that we had good friends, and to the degree we can help them, we've always helped them, and vice versa. And I think any lawyer, I mean, it doesn't matter who you're dealing with, whether you're talking, you know, the top brass of the legal fraternity all the way to the very, very bottom. I doubt very few would show up and say, I got to where I am today with no help from anybody. Like, everybody, like, that I know, even very successful lawyers, far more successful than myself, have always had mentors, people they've relied on, and people that they've leaned on in hard times to help them. And I can tell you, I was very fortunate that we had good friends that could help us. It was a little unconventional. It wasn't necessarily what I would recommend to everybody because your personality needs to suit that journey.
Right.
But these people helped us, and they weren't all necessarily, you know, what I would describe top brass of the legal fraternity, but they had enough knowledge and know-how to be dangerous in their fields to be able to help us get through our particular challenges and hurdles for that particular day, until we built up a subject matter expertise where we started concentrating and started then referring other cases out.
Right, and a couple of things there is, like, one, you can't be afraid to ask, right? A lot of people, their egos get in the way. They don't want to ask for help because it makes people think that they're not good enough. I ask for help daily. I mean, you know, all the time, and people are willing to help, and I'm willing to offer help. Sounds like you kind of have that come from that same thought process.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, what's the worst that can happen? They say, no, I'm too busy. Okay, I'll call the next person.
Someone else.
You know,
exactly. You call the next person. But you can't have an ego about it if you're trying to just take flight. You know, you're trying to get this thing off the ground. You can't have an ego about it. And I think that's the one thing is, if you want to start your practice, you got to just put the ego to the side and just work on what you need to work on to get to the result you need to get to. So, you know, kind of bringing it back down to brass tacks, let me ask you a couple questions. You know, we heard about that first year, the first couple of years. How many years or how much time would you say it took for you to, from the day you started your practice, you and Mike started your practice, till that point when you really turned a corner and felt like, okay, we got something here. This thing's rolling?
I think it was like 2.5 years before we knew we were onto something, and then it was probably 4 or 5 years before there was a monetary change in our lives.
Yeah.
You know, like, so like like there's different kind of defining moments, right? Like it could be something as small as, oh, hello, Mr. Kazerounian, good to see you in my courtroom again. Mm-hmm. Like, as small as that, like, you know, you're a staple, like, in that legal world, legal fraternity, that little microcosm of the legal world throughout the United States. Like, that's my courthouse. I belong there, right? To how many zeros are at the end of your bank account? But for me, like, money is very important. I'm not going to be disingenuous about that. Of course, right? Like, but it's a byproduct of what I get off on.
100%.
Right? It just happens that, like, I probably would not be doing it if the money could be as good, right? And so, but I do what I do because I love doing it. Right. And so, like, I love changing, like, you know, all the federal areas of law that I do, which is 99% of my practice. It's all gray in what the law is. You know, negligence law, for the most part, has been the same for the last 200 years. Yeah, right? Exactly. Whereas the statutes I'm working with, the oldest of them are from the 1960s, and the newest are from the 1990s, right? So there's this huge disparity of what the law is from circuit to circuit, even from different areas, like split within the circuits, right? And I really, really get off on trying to edge the law in the favor of the consumer and for my clients with every written motion, with every dispute that there is, and I see that as an opportunity to expand the law. It's like every case is not just about the case for me. It's bigger than that, because every decision has a consequence that's going to affect my other cases and other consumers' cases. Whereas if you lose a tort case in an average fender bender, rear ender, the law's not going to change because of that.
Right.
And
right.
I personally really get off on that and having that kind of responsibility, which I take very, very seriously, and being able to massage and get creative with the law in trying to help my clients. I get that creative element that in other areas you may not necessarily get.
Yeah, the stakes are bigger because it's bigger than just. Of course, the stakes are big for every single one of everybody's clients because for the client, that's it. That's their only case. But from a community perspective, from a law perspective, the stakes are bigger here because there could be a published opinion that changes the law in the favor of the consumer or against the consumer.
Yeah, at one stage where the TCPA law was really, really bad, the seminal case for consumers was my case from the Ninth Circuit, which I argued, which was a case called Marks versus Crunch of San Diego. And it was actually cited by the U.S. Supreme Court in the subsequent case in Digweed versus Facebook. And because of this federal practice, I've actually filed papers in 3 different cases with the United States Supreme Court. And on one case, I was literally a hair's width away from arguing in front of the Supreme Court, but it got settled before it got there.
Wow.
And so, having the legal aspect of it really is a massive thing to me, and it's what motivates me. There are other things that motivate me, but when these times come, I'm getting sworn in at the Supreme Court, and not just as a kind of like a tourist attraction kind of thing, but hey, I may actually be here.
I might be arguing a case here, yeah.
Right, and I've argued probably I don't know how many times at circuit court level, and I know I'm one step away from the U.S. Supreme Court.
Yeah.
And that's kind of to me that's the big arena, you're there.
That's the pinnacle of the profession. Of course it is.
Right.
There's no argument.
Absolutely. And so that's what really gets me going. Yeah. And like I said, the money is important, but it's a byproduct of what I'm really passionate about.
Right. All right. So let me ask you this. You obviously started your practice, took you a couple of years to get some traction, about 4 or 5 years to really kind of start financially it making sense. Somebody wants to start their practice. They come to you and they say, Mr. Kazerounian, I want to start my practice. What's the one piece of advice you can give me?
I think I think it's several things, right? I think the first thing is, why do you want to start your own practice? And what I mean why is what is motivating you? Because if it's to just go be the best lawyer you can, then it may not make sense for you to go start your own law firm, right? But if it's I genuinely want to work for myself, then my next question is, what do you want to be a specialist in? Because being a jack of all trades and master of none very rarely is going to make you a successful lawyer. Because every lawyer I know is really that's successful is really good at least at one thing.
Right.
And everybody knows I go to that person for that one thing.
Right.
Whether it's elder abuse, whether it's just to try a case, whether it's real estate law, they have that niche specialty. Right. What is that? What is it that you're most passionate about? Number 2, don't forget that it's a business first, a law firm second. Mm-hmm. I think that's really, really important.
You have to make business decisions.
For sure. Unless you keep the lights on, you can't help anybody.
Exactly.
And so you have to understand it's a business first. And I think number 3, and these are in no particular order. Number 3 is that the most creative lawyers become the best lawyers. In however way you measure success. Yeah. Whether it's in results or whether it's in monetary terms or whatever proxy that you use. Mm-hmm. If you try to follow the conventional route, there's some fundamental foundational issues that you need to follow foundationally. You can't start shepherdizing in a creative way because the blue book is the blue book. Right. But
what you mean is just because somebody argues a certain way doesn't mean you have to follow that argument. You can be creative in your own arguments as long as it's within the bounds of the law and within, don't be afraid to push the envelope. I think that's a mistake a lot of people make is they feel oh, well, I don't know anybody else doing this. Don't worry about if anybody else is doing this.
100%. So it's the way you interpret statutes, right? And so let me give you a crude analogy. This is a small example. So one of the statutes I use is a call recording statute, which is actually a penal code. It's California Penal Code 630 at SEC, which has a civil element to it, which says that in California, we're a 2-party state. meaning that I can't record a telephone call with somebody else unless they give me consent at the beginning of the phone call.
Oh,
and
speaking of which, this is being recorded.
I just, yeah. Yeah, you're guilty of a misdemeanor, sir. Yeah. And so if for the most part, if you listen to when you call banks or whatever, they changed their policies in 2012-13 because of a lot of my lawsuits. So when you call, there's a pre-recorded IVR now. Let's say Bank of America, for example. There's a pre-recorded IVR that says all calls may be monitored or recorded for quality assurance.
Right.
Now, they think they've adhered to the statute and using common sense, potentially, right? But I've made the argument that this call may be monitored or recorded. It doesn't tell me anything because if they're saying may, they're also telling me it may not.
Right. That's right.
So it's that ability, and again, it's a crude analogy, and it's not really like maybe honing in the point as well as I want it to.
No, I know exactly what you're talking about.
But it's the ability for the lawyer to take a step back, look at the statute or look at the language in question and go, is it saying what they're purporting it to say? How am I going to interpret this? And at the end of the day, your job is to go and persuade a judge that it means what you believe it says rather than what the other side believes it says, right? And it's that ability to be creative in your arguments because I'm like, actually, they're telling me they may not be recording me.
Right.
Which is as true.
Right, which is as true. And that's not what the statute says. The statute
and I've had a judge fly off on that, and I've had a judge tell me go pound sand on that.
Right.
So again, it's about being smart, knowing your forum, knowing your judges, knowing the law, and being an authority on the subject matter that you're going to go be creative about. And that creativity, and it could be in trial practice, it could be in statutory interpretation, it could be in motion practice and oral argument, it could be in everything. And it could be in the way you run your business. But creativity is a key element that distinguishes exceptional lawyers from good lawyers. Yeah,
I agree. I mean, that was awesome. We're gonna have to wrap up because we're wrapping up on time. But I need more of these stories from the early years. That was fantastic. I was captivated. I was losing track of time. So I appreciate you being on. I just want to say to everybody that's listening, thank you. Go out there, and just because, guys like Abbas make it look effortless now doesn't mean that it was effortless in the beginning. So go forth, be creative, and work hard. Thank you, Abbas.